Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the TF podcast, where we talk about technology finance and usually revolve that around Bitcoin, blockchain, and cryptocurrency. I am here with Kristy-Leigh Minahan. We've had her on the show many times, and she's been speaking at our conferences throughout different cities, actually. And she's one of the top folks in the world when it comes to cryptocurrency mining, as well as other things, and has been in the space for a really long time. So with that, Kristy, I'd love if you could introduce yourself really fast to everybody.
Yeah, I'm just a technology consultant specializing in mining and blockchain technologies. And I've been working in this space professionally since 2010, dabbling since 2009, and very passionate about proof of work and consensus algorithms in general.
Yeah. So let's kind of go right into there. So 2009 proof of work is the main thing there during that time, and you've been very passionate about that for basically since then, obviously. What are your thoughts overall on proof of work versus proof of stake? I know I've asked you this before, but I just always love hearing you talk about it.
They're different consensus mechanisms trying to solve different problems. So in a proof of work environment, your stake, let me rephrase, it's still staking. In proof of work, your stake in the network is actually tied up in your CapEx and your OpEx investment. So you've got your hardware that you've, purchased and that you've staked to say, hey, I have skin in the game, I have skin in the network. And then you also have ongoing OpEx costs, electricity, maintenance, development costs where applicable, which is part of your ongoing stake to contributing to crypto. And as part of your reward for having skin in the network and being a good citizen, you get a percent of the mining rewards. In a proof of stake environment, it is the same sort of idea, except now your stake, your skin in the game is digital. So you have, you've tied up assets, you've tied up investment, you've tied up, in the context of Ethereum, you've tied up a percent of your Ethereum, and you're not allowed to touch it. And you have to be a good steward, and you have ongoing OpEx costs in the form of maintaining your validators or staking nodes, or whatever terminology on your chosen proof of stake network they use. So they're very similar in a lot of ways. It's just that the asset that becomes your skin in the game is either physical or digital. And physical and digital have different threat vectors associated with it. So in a proof of work network, if you get attacked over the network, people can't really take away your physical equipment. You can shut down the machines, you can take them offline, you can reflash them, and you still can recoup some of your investment from those assets, especially if they are GPUs, or if they're CPUs, or if they're FPGAs. Whereas in a proof of stake network, it may be harder to attack someone. There may not be a greater attack surface, but once you have gone after someone, you've socially engineered someone, or you've got an access to someone's keys, that's it. It's game over. So proof of stake is, technically it's a little easier to attack and exploit someone. Doesn't mean that either of these consensus algorithms are any more secure or less secure than the other. They're just different things, trying to solve different problems.
Right. And there's this perception that a proof of stake method for mining is, call it, better for the environment, or reduces less energy or uses less energy, correct?
Yes, there is that perception, and a lot of times it's flawed.
Right.
In a proof of stake, environment, there is still infrastructure running somewhere. It still exists. There are still data centers. There's still redundancy. There's still networking that has to be applied. It's on a smaller scale, sure, but there's a cost associated with that. Again, it's that physical versus digital. In a proof of work environment, it is not like the infrastructure is magically it's magically new. That energy already existed. Those utility companies already existed. That amount of electricity already existed. No one was utilizing it before. And in a way, what proof of work has allowed is it's allowed more consumption to take place of these utilities that would otherwise, either the energy would be burned off and put into the ground and create more waste, or it just would be, not sold. The other thing that's important to think about is that Bitcoin is inherently renewable. Miners have gone to great lengths to pursue renewable energy sources and to think about how to build clean, green infrastructure. So you have containers, you have companies solely dedicated to consuming natural gas productions, natural gas pipelines, and using the excess to mine Bitcoin. You have miners trying to heat their homes with ASIC devices. You have all sorts of miners that are pursuing hydro power and solar power and wind power. And yes, some of them are using it in conjunction with non-renewable energy, but they're still, more green than our traditional infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have to compare. Many people make this argument and they just point at it and go, well, look at all that energy waste, instead of thinking about, hang on, what was Bitcoin meant to replace? It was meant to replace a world banking ecosystem. And Bitcoin today still consumes less globally than the US banking system consumes. When you add up all of the ATMs, all of the infrastructure, all of the offices, all of the humans, all of the waste there, all of the redundancy, all of the data centers, it just adds up. And so I don't think anyone's actually done a very fair comparison of, hang on, here is a banking system versus here is Bitcoin. That is the fair comparison to make. You can't just point at Bitcoin and say, hey, it consumes a lot of energy, when it's specifically designed to replace something that already exists.
Sure.
And
I'd love
yes,
to see,
proof
has
of stake,
anybody done that? Has
no,
anybody,
no
that'd be
one's done
really,
it.
yeah.
No one's done it. And part of this is because you notice that there's not a lot of good research in the cryptocurrency space, because too often people are very religious. So you rarely find someone who can have a neutral discussion on proof of work and proof of stake.
Mm-hmm.
It is just they're very religious about one or the other. And if you talk about one or the other, even if you don't have even if you're not religious to one side, people will label you as such. And so you get a lot of people who talk about the economics of proof of work and the psychology behind it getting attacked by proof of stake maximalists, and vice versa. Cryptocurrency is a very, very political, highly religious, highly passionate ecosystem. And this I guess, influences a lot of the research that exists.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting when you have kind of the human nature element or the altruistic points of view that then cloud like business decisions, or I guess kind of like an economic point of view. So the reason I wanted to start the conversation here is, kind of going into we're going into the halving right now. I don't know, 2 weeks away or about. And so mining rewards are gonna basically get cut in half, right? And it's going to be more difficult essentially to mine. What does that do to overall energy consumption production? Is it, so now does it become, quote unquote, more of a problem, or is it more going back to, I guess, what you've been talking about? So it's more of a perceived problem, but not necessarily more of a problem because of the items that you articulated already, right?
It doesn't really affect energy consumption. It's more that, does it affect participants in the ecosystem? Most of the large farms have already upgraded their equipment, so it's not like they're just going to suddenly drop out. There is this, this pervasive myth that miners switch their machines on and off according to profitability. It's slowly being disproven by others this year, but it's complete garbage.
Mm-hmm.
Most miners you talk to will just huddle through, a crypto winter. They have minimum consumption requirements to meet. So it means their utility provider doesn't just allow them to switch on and off devices. For a lot of the smaller miners, they've started hosting with other companies, and so they don't just suddenly switch on and off their equipment according to profitability, because they also have requirements to make to the hosting provider. So they simply, work through. The ones that are sitting on S9s, T2Ts, A10s, a lot of the older, sorry, not A10s, Avalon's 800 series. The ones that are on the older generation equipment, they have either already made plans to upgrade after the halving, or they are simply going to hash out their days with that equipment. They may move it to a lower cost region and just let it naturally phase out there, or they may try to recycle it. In a lot of cases, people are looking for alternatives to recycling because the cost of recycling is higher than what the device is actually worth.
Oh,
You
interesting.
see,
Why is
yeah,
that? Just breaking it apart, or what makes
so
that?
there's not many valuable components on a traditional ASIC PCB. The ASIC chips itself are useless. We have seen some creative providers reusing S9 and Litecoin machine cases. So the housing of an ASIC, we've seen fans being reused for other applications. And so there's a healthy secondhand market for fans and cases, but this is also very niche. So you can't expect to flood, 2-3 million components through it. You'll only flood about 100,000 K units max. So there is a niche there, but in general on an ASIC, there's very little parts that, are worth retrieving. In a traditional motherboard, you usually have gold plated components. You have some other precious metals and materials that you might want to salvage and turn into something else. In ASICs, you don't really have a lot of that. A majority of the component cost is that silicon chip, which is useless. And so many miners are just thinking, well, I can either dump it in a landfill or I can send it to a place. I can put it on a gas pipeline and, basically have free electricity, or I can send it to some really shady region in Uzbekistan or a Russian bloc country and just let it hash out its days and die there. And, if it grows legs and walks away one night, that's fine. Free recycling. So there's really, not a sense of urgency of protecting these devices.
Yeah.
And so what's probably going to happen after the halving, there will be a very slow phase of hash rate drop. And this is natural. This happens, whenever there is a big price event, but mostly it'll be miners taking some of their older equipment offline and then spinning up newer equipment. Power consumption will remain relatively the same, or it will increase, and hash rate will steadily increase again.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that, like that breakdown. So what do you think things like the halving mean from a business context, and more from like the enterprise side? So you said you yourself have been through basically every halving, and how have you seen things evolve since then? So my assumption would be the hype around what's happening in a couple weeks is much higher than it was at the previous halving.
Yes, a little bit. So your first halving, there were very few, I would say, industrial players, but it did affect purchasing decisions. So a lot of the cloud mining companies and a lot of the real estate investors were thinking, hey, if after the halving our rewards increase, how many machines should we purchase? What's going to be the kind of demand? There was a bit of planning there, but it was on a much smaller scale. It was only spread about, I would say, 10 to 15 different entities. The second halving, your surface increased greatly. You had about 100 to 150 entities starting to talk about, what do we do? What do we do if rewards decrease? What if the hash rate drops, etc. With this halving, because you've got so many new participants that came in during the 2017 and 2018 crypto boom, because you have it blasted over every single news outlet and everyone's talking about it on podcasts. It's in everyone's minds. Everyone wants to have an opinion on it. So it's well collateralized in media, and there's a lot more drama than there necessarily needs to be. Any smart miner that's been in the space knows that there's scheduled halvings. They always plan for it, and it's simply treated as a adjustment to inflation.
Yeah.
And rewards will decrease, but that doesn't mean the price of Bitcoin will stay the same. Usually it will go up. It might take a very small hit if our traditional markets keep going the way they're going, but it always adjusts in the end. Bitcoin is an incredibly efficient market as it stands.
Sure.
So not much is going to change. It is heavily overblown, but it's I think the next halving is going to be just as bad. So
Yeah. Um, and it's funny how like you're talking a little bit about this when we first started, like the religion of it, right? Or
mhm.
the kind of like the altruistic or the views that people have. So is that kind of what you think is it's more of that culture is why the halving is being overblown? Is there business opportunities that people are taking, or is it more just the marketability in your perspective? I'm curious from the
I
miner
think
perspective.
it's just the marketability. It's
Yeah.
just that it's an easy news article to talk about. It is a subject that everyone can have an opinion on, from miners to economists to
Yeah.
just outside investors. It's a very easy talking point, and you have newcomers, you have old timers. Everyone can give a point of view.
Right. So I know we don't normally talk about price, but you hear people ask all the time, like, is the halving price is the Bitcoin price into the halving? What are your thoughts on that? On even that statement to begin with?
It's incredibly stupid. It's like saying, hey, a recession is priced into our stock market. Markets are driven by human psychology. They're not driven by rational parameters. There is a reason why, economists just have theories, and it's essentially educated guesses. Talk to anyone in the finance space and they will tell you that. It's essentially everyone is just making educated guesses.
Hmm.
Um, our traditional markets today are highly uncorrelated with what is happening in reality. We had the massive drop due to the coronavirus, and a lot of panic selling there in both our traditional markets as well as crypto markets. And now we have insane amounts of money printing going on, and the markets are barely phased. We have the Fed dumping tons of cash into the system, and that should normally panic investors if they're smart, but it's not doing anything to the markets. It's actually helping them.
Hmm.
um, this is because markets are not rational. They're driven by human psychology. It's entirely psychology based. And so a news report could come out from multiple entities tomorrow all stating that Bitcoin is highly insecure, and it might not have no basis, or no ground in reality, yet people will eat that up and use that to make purchasing decisions, and they will panic sell their Bitcoin, and Bitcoin price will crash. Similarly, you could have a giant exchange hack right after the halving, and that might crash the price of Bitcoin. There's no one factor you can point to that is attributed to an overall price decrease.
Yeah.
I think what has always happened in all the past halvings is that there has been a price increase 3 to 6 months later, and it's been a substantial one. It's been a new, not always a new all-time high, but it's been getting there. And so that's what I think we'll see happen. The halving will hit, miners will, mining hardware will drop off the network. Slowly, the price of Bitcoin will start to rise as new investors become bullish, people accumulate more, miners accumulate more. The price will naturally gravitate upwards. And it's also tied nicely into the seasonal trends. So we always see a seasonal increase around about October, November, December. Sometimes it's out a couple of months, it extends into January and February, but we always see that seasonal trend. So that is definitely going to happen.
Yeah. So, switching topics a little bit, and you brought it up a little bit here with the price of Bitcoin going down and the markets in general as a result of COVID. What about mining? How has mining been affected by COVID-19? Just the industry as a whole. Have those that are running the operations, are there, are they still working? Is it the machines just running in the background still? What are your thoughts, and what do you know about your contacts in China and vice versa on how
Mhm.
that sort of has been happening?
So what has been really interesting is that most of the U.S. miners er, heavily dispute this. So in China, most of the operations are entirely remote. Yes, you need someone on site to troubleshoot machines, fix a dead hash board. But when it comes to overall overseeing operations and management, you can do this remotely.
Right.
And so
And you're
COVID
obviously
didn't,
qualified to talk about China because you lived there for many years working in
yes,
in mining facilities.
yes.
Yeah.
Um, and so a lot of people just frankly don't think about, how efficient it is to run a network at scale in China like that. Now, that isn't to say that COVID didn't affect operations. It did. So Bitcoin farms, a lot of workers had to stay home. So there are not people there to triage hash boards. So if you have a dead machine, it stays dead for the period of quarantine. It affected components quite heavily, and we'll
Like,
dive into that in a sec.
okay.
So components being things like transistors, capacitors, fans, your whole supply chain was constrained, which affected the availability of spare parts as well as the availability of new machines. Manufacturers in China had to suspend operations. So MicroBT could no longer fulfill shipments and could no longer distribute machines. Bitmain had this issue, Canaan had this issue. Everyone sort of stepped down their production. There was, there was an overall pressure that you're seeing from traditional quarantine. That didn't mean that our hash rate decreased in Bitcoin. Quite the contrary, it remained steady aside from some small fluctuations. Again, data centers, if they had issues, that was that. Utility companies, if there was an issue with the power, no one could come out to troubleshoot. As quarantine started to relax, some of these things opened. So as long as, social distancing was enforced, no one was on the premises, power companies could come out and triage some of the equipment. I had one farm in particular that had a transformer blow up at the worst possible time.
Hmm.
It was a week into quarantine
Wow.
over there. And so they had to wait, I think it was 2.5 weeks to get someone out to triage and fix the situation. China has started to resume life a little bit. What's probably going to happen is there's going to be pockets of corona that resurface, and this is going to, the whole quarantine will have to be repeated, and this is going to continue on, not just in China, but in most countries until we have a vaccine in place. That's just a given with how this virus works.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the US, people have panicked quite heavily. All operations have been suspended. Most of the data centers only need one or two data center techs on site at any one time to manage, a good 30 megawatt facility if you're efficient. So again, they're pretty good as long as they're taking into effect social distancing, making sure that, they're quarantining well, got their protective gear. The Bitcoin market was surprisingly resilient. The altcoin market, not so much. So altcoin ASICs and altcoin FPGAs got hit a lot harder. Many companies just up and stopped working. So you had in the altcoin space, prominent, some of the prominent providers of hashing equipment for ASICs just didn't do deliveries, didn't do any sort of replying to emails, replying to WeChat messages. They had just shut up shop. So that is a recurring theme.
And so what's driving that theme? Is it because they don't have
Quarantine. It's
sure, but like,
enforced.
so I get that, but like, why would they be more? Why would the altcoin manufacturer or hardware manufacturers be more affected than Bitcoin hardware manufacturer?
Partly because they're cushioned against things in the Bitcoin space. They have much larger teams to work with.
Yeah.
And it's just naturally more resilient. Bitcoin had just had its new upgraded cycle, whereas in the altcoin space, they were just getting into their equipment manufacturing cycle.
Got it.
So it has everything to do with sort of the supply and distribution of the coins and the life cycle they were in.
Yeah, yeah. So you were telling me a little bit ago before we got on this call, just because we're talking mining here and hardware, that a mining operator, sorry, a mining manufacturer, a hardware manufacturer has a kill switch and basically execute it or use that. Is that true? Or let's talk more about that. I want to.
So a recent thing in the ecosystem that everyone's buzzing about is there is a firmware manufacturer. So
Firmware.
to catch everyone up to speed, you have in your mining stack, you have hardware, firmware, and then you have software. And so firmware is sort of the link between it, getting data from the pool, which tells the chips what to do in layman's terms.
Yeah,
It
the
affects things like,
software for the hardware. Is that
yes,
right? Yeah.
correct. And there's a thriving ecosystem of alternative firmware providers to Canon, Bitmain, and whatever ships by default on the device. What specifically happened was, from what I can gather, and again, this is all secondhand information, an individual that was using this firmware was going to appear on a podcast. The firmware maker did not like this and said, hey, we're going to give you, the option to either step down from the podcast and we'll give you a discount on your fees, or if you go on this podcast, we're going to have to terminate service to you. And what they actually did was they make it so that they will stop collecting fees from the devices running this firmware. So how firmware developers get, paid or get monetized is they take a percent of everything mined.
Yeah.
Very accepted practice. If they stop collecting dev fees, then the device is going to stop working. So they said, hey, if you go on this podcast, we're going to stop collecting fees. The firmware will no longer work. So you have to make a decision. This is bringing up a lot of questions in the mining community about, do firmware developers have a right to play God? Do they have a right to set standards? Do they have a right to discriminate against who uses their software? Do people have a right to deny service based upon, what podcast someone goes on? Now, yes, that does happen in traditional markets.
Mm-hmm.
At any time, Xilinx is allowed, not Xilinx, sorry, at any time Microsoft can deny you service. At any time, a company can say, hey, I'm going to terminate usage of this application. YouTube, suspends your account if you violate their terms of service. Okay, that exists. But mining, what attracted people to mining in the original instance is that human element was removed. Now we're bringing back that human element into Bitcoin and into Bitcoin mining and saying humans have the right to police each other. It's no longer permissionless. It's starting to become slowly centralized. And that is concerning to a lot of people. It's concerning to a lot of miners. So it's bringing up some interesting questions in the space about, what should happen with mining firmware and mining hardware in general. And does Bitcoin remain a permissionless system? And how does it remain a permissionless system?
Yeah. It's that's super fascinating, and it's I think it goes back to now the business practice versus like the religion versus like the what's the right thing to do, and how people are thinking through that. I remember you told me that you spent quite a bit of time in different countries, working on Bitcoin mining and so forth. I'll let you say the ones if you want to, but I was curious about something that's kind of like sidestepping here, and that's so North Korea, right? I just had Alex Gladstein on the podcast, and we were talking about that. But I'm curious about your point of view, because North Korea has like a ton of Bitcoin, right? And so, are they mining Bitcoin? Do you know much about that, or kind of like how some of these
Nothing.
Okay,
Not
I was just
something I
curious
can
more.
comment on.
Yeah, I was curious if you knew kind of like about how like the authoritative, maybe not North Korea, but just like authoritative governments in general, like how they might be thinking about like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency from like mining
Well,
perspectives,
we can
or
talk a little bit about China. I mean,
yeah,
China's plan ultimately is they want to control Bitcoin, and they want to ensure that they remain a majority superpower. So they're being very supportive of mining. In fact, today the press release came out from the Yan province, which I might be bastardizing that. Sorry, Chinese native speakers. Accents are not an Australian's forte, but they are supporting the build out of a local blockchain technology park used for cryptocurrency mining. So this is the first sort of public in your face local government support of crypto mining. So the Chinese government understands that it's going to be a thing. They know it happens. This is sort of their way of saying, hey, we want to ensure it's all taking place.
yeah,
What are their alternatives? People flee the country with people move their machines overseas and China loses a grip on the currency. So it's very much become, and we should ensure that we have a firm grasp on it, and a firm control on it. To most governments right now, it is very much a nuisance. It's still very low in market cap. It is not. There are a lot of people that think their specific shitcoin is going to get government attention when it has a 20 million market cap. This is nothing to a government. They don't care. Just pay your taxes. That's all the government cares about ultimately. Pay your taxes. If you pay your taxes, they couldn't care less what you do. As long as you're not, killing someone or endangering someone, just pay your taxes. You'll be fine. But China is starting to see that the US is very much behind when it comes to cryptocurrency regulation, very much up behind when it comes to blockchain adoption. And so in their quest to have technical superiority, they're making a leap at it. And I think it's the right move.
Yeah.
Will the outcome be, what I would like? No, but, at least it's hitting the news. More and more people are getting engaged and talking about blockchain, and it's hitting mainstream media.
So can we dive into that a little bit more? The blockchain versus Bitcoin aspect in relation to China, right? So there was that recent news, for instance, that China is starting to test or showcase or whatever the digital RMB, and like they're going to test it with Starbucks and McDonald's and so forth. So there's that side of it. I do want to talk about that. But you said something that I thought was fascinating, that I don't think a lot of people realize, and that's that China wants to have a major stake of Bitcoin or in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So I'd love to just talk a little bit more about that. Like why do they want that? Is it from the point of view of Bitcoin being a global backed currency? Is it just that, hey, like they see the potential? Is it like the ability to leapfrog? All the above? What are your thoughts there?
I don't think it's any of those. It's simply that China isn't really using blockchain. They're using, a ledger, a very centralized controlled ledger, and labeling it blockchain. And they're just
sure.
And they're just doing this, they're doing this because it makes sense for them technically.
No, and sorry,
results.
and I mean more on so I want to talk about the blockchain side, but I mean more on the Bitcoin side. So you're saying from the Bitcoin side, it makes sense for them?
No, they don't differentiate between blockchain and Bitcoin in that way. So the central government is blockchain pro, anti-Bitcoin. The local government is we embrace Bitcoin because it consumes utilities and it makes our province be more profitable. It has better quality of life, creates more jobs, yada yada yada.
Got it.
So it has everything to do with when talking about China, you have to think in central and local variants. And so their blockchain projects have nothing to do with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a really basic rudimentary form of money. Potentially that's all money has to be. But what China is developing on the blockchain side is really a network that can help bleed over into their stocks and investments in their markets. It can help make the banking system more efficient. It's backed by yuan, and it nicely slots into the existing WeChat and mobile infrastructure that China already has.
Yeah, with their native digital currency essentially that they're building out. Right?
Correct.
And what's interesting too is that I was talking about this with someone else, but it makes a lot of sense for, like you're saying, it makes a lot of sense for China. Like why wouldn't they want to do that in the sense of being more efficient and being able to send money quicker, and also the traceability and the tracking of essentially currency and transactions. I know you spent a lot of time there. Do you think, is it something that's going to be adopted with ease by the people? Does it have to be because that's just the way it is there? It'll
be adopted with ease.
Yeah.
The people will love it. I mean, WeChat Pay took off quite fast. You can use cash for some things in China, but literally everything is done through WeChat Pay. Mm-hmm. Beggars, taxis, food, it doesn't matter where you are in China. As long as you have a mobile phone and you can scan a QR code, you're going to be able to navigate around and pay for things. And so the people, if the product is done right and it sort of sits in the back like blockchain should naturally,
Sure.
the people will see no difference between using this and using WeChat Pay. In fact, it might just be WeChat Pay altogether from the user perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Well, what are some interesting things that you're starting to see? You know, I know you always have your ear to the ground with what's happening. Just really just with everything for the most part. But it's specifically with mining or even crypto. What are you kind of excited for that's coming up, or what are you paying attention to?
I'm definitely paying attention to the firmware space. Um, Paying attention to the mining hardware fight. There's an ongoing perpetual fight between Bitmain, MicroBT, Canaan, eBang, and the new and up and coming providers, Layer One and Carbon, SBI Carbon. So paying attention to all these providers that are all, beating their chest and saying they're the best.
Mm-hmm.
Paying attention to the new IPO filings. So many people might be aware that eBang, which they might get upset if I say this, but they are, let me figure out a nicer way to say it. They're not the first choice of mining equipment provider within China. So they're very niche. They recently decided to file for an IPO for $100 million in the US. They would join the ranks of Bitmain and Canaan in IPO filings. So far, only Canaan has successfully gone through with an IPO, and it has been disastrous to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got these big players that are all seeing, going public in the US as a liquidity event, and people are getting excited about that. Because so many of these IPOs have been found to be very scammy isn't the right word, but it may be the appropriate one. Questionable. People have, there may be tighter regulations around doing a crypto IPO in the future. The government is starting to become smarter about these IPOs. They're starting to dig into some of these questionable numbers and these questionable connections. So paying attention to that, paying attention to the altcoin space specifically, the rapid transition from GPU to FPGA to ASIC now, and all of the altcoins. Handshake's a great example. Paying attention to the FPGA space and new entrants coming in. FPGA hardware, relatively disappeared in the early Bitcoin days. It was sort of a thing in 2010 and 2011, and then it was replaced by ASICs. FPGAs have started to make a comeback, and we have some public players like Xilinx and like Avnet that are getting into the space and saying, hey, how can we, support this this generation of customers that are buying our hardware? So some interesting stuff is going on there, and definitely, interested in the transition from proof of work to proof of stake as it pertains to Ethereum. It will be interesting to see how they handle that one.
That's definitely been something that's been talked about for a long time. Is it going to happen? Is it possible? Like, is it how
Of
far?
course it's going to happen.
But
It will
sorry,
always.
I should rephrase that. Sure, it will happen, but is it likely that it happens at the timeline that people want it to happen in?
Well, everyone has, that's a bit of an open-ended question, right? Because everyone has their own timeline. A bunch of people want it to happen tomorrow. A bunch of people say full proof of stake will only happen in 5 years. A bunch of people say it will only happen, we might get the first phase this year, which allows staking, but it hasn't decoupled entirely from proof of work. So
Yeah.
it's very much something that is up in the air, and the reality is no one knows. It will be done when it's done. It doesn't mean that it's a rudimentary technology, or that Ethereum is any weaker just because it hasn't rolled over to proof of stake yet. It's just cutting edge technology takes time. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
So.
Sure. Totally. Totally. Well, Kristy, I really appreciate you coming on again. I'd love to, I guess, leave you with the last word, or if there's a question that you want people to think through as they go about their day while they're listening to this, or something you want to leave them to kind of contemplate.
Oh, geez. Uh,
This is always coming.
yeah, but I like half the time I don't even have something that I'm contemplating. Um, geez. If let me see. What would the community? Oh, how is the recent oil crash going to affect Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining? Will it? Will we see new use cases for oil potentially?
Hmm. I like that. I like that. Well, will it? No, we'll have to find out later, I guess.
Fuck if I know. I'm not an expert in oil.
No, that's crazy. Awesome. Well, hey, thank you, Kristy. I really appreciate the time. And what are the best ways that people can get in contact with you or follow you?
Through Twitter is the preferred method. So if you want to reach out to me, hit me up on Twitter at ohgodagirl, or feel free to email me at ohgodagirl@gmail.com.
Excellent. Awesome. Thanks so much. Everybody, thank you for listening to another episode of the TF podcast. Please make sure that you are subscribed wherever you are listening to this right now, whether that be YouTube or Apple or Spotify for the podcast. If you like this, please fill in those stars and let us know. And please make sure that you're following us on Twitter. I'm at JG Product and at TF Blockchain. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.